Okay, welcome everybody. I am Tessa Giblin, I'm the director of Talbot Rice Gallery, and it's a really great pleasure to introduce you to David Claerbout. As you know, he's opening a solo exhibition in Talbot Rice this evening. You're very, very welcome to come. And it's a great opportunity to see 6 of his artworks across our white galleries. This is not the first time we've made an exhibition together. It's the second, and for me, one of the things I love about David is not just the individual works, which he'll probably focus on showing you here tonight, but it's also the way he goes about exhibition making. And in the exhibition that you'll see in Talbot Rice, you'll see the kind of primary concerns of his practice, time, space, manipulation of images, all taking place across the exhibition format as well as the artworks themselves. So please come and enjoy it and notice those moments in which works start to speak together and, create their magic. David, who's Belgian and currently living in Antwerp and Berlin, he'll no doubt tell you more about where he came from as an artist, but in the recent years, he's been the subject of many major museum exhibitions, including the Stadel Museum in Frankfurt, Schaulager in Basel, and if you like what you hear today, see tonight, he's creating exhibitions later this year at Kunsthaus Bregenz and the voluminous spaces of Les Abattoirs in Toulouse. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you David Claerbout.
Thank you. Thank you, Tessa. So I was thinking maybe by way of introduction, while the keynote is running on autopilot, showing an overview of some exhibitions that I've made over the years. I might want to talk to you about something that's happening in photography, or maybe more broadly speaking, happening to the mechanical image. And by mechanical image, I mean an image that can exist by way of click, triggering, or anything that doesn't need or doesn't require craftsmanship. So basically, photography, all centered around photography in my work. Although I wasn't trained as a photographer, my interest very early was going towards the still image rather than the moving image, because I didn't have much access or training in the moving image, and I was really self-taught through the years to handle a video camera and get a notion of what a script or a storyboard might look like. I always had a lot of difficulties with it, not in the least with storytelling, and there was from the beginning, because I probably was trained from painting out and lithography, drawing, I had a certain resistance to the moving image, and that might explain why much of my work is characterized with this tension between the still and the moving image. But not so much on a technical level, but far more on a narrative level, because what made me resist was that psychologically, one always had to enter into the mind of somebody else, somebody who takes you on a journey through a story and through a mental journey. And I think, therefore, my interest in photography grew. I started to collect photography, even though I was unable to handle a camera. And I've noticed through the years, up until today, that some things are changing to the way the mechanical image is working in society or in life and the way we relate to it. And I would say that the past 160 years, or actually to be more precise, since 1860, the shock that the invention of photography provided is slowly fading and changing beyond recognition, but we don't know. We don't know when it happened, how this change occurred. We were never informed. And I tend to think that we're not supposed to know. We're not supposed to know when photography actually lost this idea of mutual connection between the author and the subject. And I feel that the mechanical image is becoming, or is returning to a state which lies right before the invention of photography, where ideology is making its re-entrance into photography. And of course, you know, anything I say, theoretically, it might be able to counter it or to give arguments against it. So bear with me for a moment. I'm still a bit fragile in what I'm saying. But let's just think for a moment that photography, as it shocked the world of image making, including painting, printmaking, and the distribution of knowledge, the way it shocked couldn't have been more radical. All of a sudden there was this crystal clear image that said everything, and you needed no words anymore to understand it. You needed no more story, no more history, nobody explaining to you, no more cues, no more religion. And it was just an instant thing happening. Although it was anterior, there was this uncanny relationship between spatial presence and temporal anteriority, as Roland Barthes formulated it. And I think this lasted for a while, changing radically again with the advent of digital media, digital technology. And what digital technology does is it does more than facilitate all technologies or make it easier to use them. It does more than the democratization of formerly hardly accessible technologies made for specialists. It's much more than that. It's seeming eradication of difficulty in production, I think hides something else. It hides a return of the word into the image. And the word, you could also think of the word as ideology, the things that you're not aware of, you're carrying inside yourself as ideals, but which you constantly export to the outside world without being aware of them. But also information, data. The one who, and you can actually already see it crystallized in the way we use our phones and camera phones, and the way information and data are making a reintroduction into the image. It's quite striking. Practically, this goes from minimal interventions, but from which you can feel that they might have large consequences, like your device being able to capture the information where you were, which moment of the day you took a picture, which angle you took it, even which type of image you were trying to compose. And maybe alone, the classifications of the type of images that you were trying to compose are themselves a reduction or dividing images into classes, new classes, which of course existed before, but which are becoming crystallized now. So there's the class of the landscape, there's the class of the portrait, there's also probably the class of the war photograph or the image taken during distress. There's all these new categories, while before, during, let's say, analog photography, there was only contingency. There was what you were capable to do as an author, and there was the things happening in the world in front of your eyes. I know all this is purely conceptual. There are errors in what I'm saying, of course. Classification was always present in image making from the early paintings on. But I have the feeling sometimes that we're returning to a situation where we're losing the momentum of photography. And we're giving it back to people with power who will decide what you're looking at. So information becomes the next 50% of perception. All this I noticed only during the last 5 to 10 years when I started working with 3D animation. Before that, my resistance to voiceover narrative, so to speak, to somebody inviting you or trying to explain what you're supposed to see, so as opposed to independent perception, in 3D animation, I noticed that when one composes a picture, it requires lengthy discussions about even the smallest elements. And I made a piece, the first piece that I made in 3D animation, of which I might show something later, and this is a study, which is titled Travel and which is in the exhibition. Was a short film based upon a piece of relaxation music of which I had a collection back in the end of the 90s. And I somehow was always attracted to relaxation music exactly because it provided easy answers to musical themes. And also it provided very clear images carried by the music. And I kind of considered this relaxation music as sort of populist politics, where the answers are so obvious you don't want to believe them. And so that led to me making this first 3D animation. Discussions about how the grass needs to look like, the flowers, the vegetation, the type of light, endless back and forth discussions which make you feel as if you have a kind of godlike presence over the world and in deciding in how things should look like. And maybe if that is the future of photography, it means that information and decisions which lie outside of you, which somebody else has made for you, become very important and become important in what you perceive. So let's assume for a moment that there are two types of perception. One is the mind's eye, is anything you see through thinking, and that includes data, information, the word, literature. And the other is the world of photography, or in which photography played the advocate for 150 years, of sort of accidental perception, which is truly modern in the sense that it could be anything, and there's always an aspect of magic. Now this magic, slowly but certainly, and I discovered that through working with travel, becomes prescripted. Or I will put it differently, my fear is that it might become prescripted. I think this is a process that's already going on, but it kind of explained to me how a way or a position of how to look at how photography was and why it did destroy painting so rapidly and why it necessitated a whole generation of modern artists, starting from Francisco Goya, and shocked them so much so that painting was never the same. Maybe it's possible that exactly this process that shocked away painting from its dominant position is going to be what's happening to photography. Whereas the process might be one of return. On political and social, economical level, we often hear that we're going back to the 19th century in terms of the class divide and the way the 1% rules again. And maybe in terms of image technology, something similar is going on. That we're going back towards the tableau, where anything that might appear momentous, like a snapshot, even in a war zone, in fact is defined as something that pre-existed and that didn't actually take place. So that brings me to Jean Baudrillard, of whom I very highly appreciate, especially his positions in photography, and he was himself also an amateur photographer, quite a good one. But I will not elaborate too much on that so far for this introduction. And maybe while I'm going to show something about my kitchen or my recipes for the way I work, as a way of introduction, I should maybe say that if photography are optics based upon natural light, or at least an external light source, which makes of photography quite a hopeful medium by definition. You know, that's why it's modern. It's all about, it's a religion of light. The new dark optics are presenting themselves as images, photographic ones, but they're made from the dark vaults of information, so to speak. And I think maybe there's a place for artists to crawl out of that. And much of the work that I've been making, and I realized this is just a process of years, I realized this recently, is crawling out of these dark optics and of these information situations and basically trying to reconnect from memory, from darkness, as if somebody who has lost all vision, and try to reconnect to simple phenomena such as light, movement of wind, water, ice, sound, the hearing, and the definitions of hearing, such as in radio piece, which is also in the exhibition. If is hearing something that comes from the outside world and which we perceive, or is hearing something that's already happening exclusively in between the two ears. Which brings me to the first work in the exhibition that I want to talk about, which is titled Radio Piece. It's a small work, and it's kind of atypical because I don't use sound very often. Sound, with its characteristics of flowing like a river, meandering from one situation to the next, has this compatibility or the similarity to the moving image in the sense that it pins you down and it doesn't let you go. All you can do is turn around and decide to go away or switch off the sound. It's in a different category of the still image, which always somehow leaves you the liberty of manipulating it, giving your attention or not. And with Radio Piece, I wanted to thematize this idea of mental space. Remember, information, data, things that come from the dark vaults of information and then reappear as an image. Mental space versus real physical space. And I found this book on Hong Kong, on the old vertical city of Kowloon, which is now torn down, of which you see one still. And this brought me to the idea that I wanted to work with, on one hand, this very exquisite sound quality, which travels through your head and which does all sorts of things with you, allowed by this technology called binaural sound, which is a microphone that mimics human hearing, which gives a very three-dimensional sound, versus physical space, or even the lack of physical space in urban situations. And Hong Kong is a good example of it. And as with any work, I would do a number of months, even years of research, but I tend not to research like a scientist. I tend to research like somebody who's on a retirement, who's got all the time in the world. So I let things happen and then I just put them away again and I pick them up a few months later. This is generally how I would work. to the great irritation sometimes of the people in my studio, because while we're in the midst of a project, I will say, let's just bury it for a few months and continue on the other, which can be a challenge. This is the device in question. It's just a wooden head with two sophisticated little microphones. And that's the principle of binaural sound. Oh yeah, that looks fancy, but... And that's the set while we were conceiving it while constructing it. This was all not very planned. What's great with having a large studio in which you can do more or less anything, and that's the principle of my artist practice, is that we just have to take off the shelves. For years and years I collected all the materials that you need as a filmmaker, but also as a photographer and also for sound, so that we could just take it off the shelf and start experimenting with it. And this is what we did in the studio. We built a 14-meter track, a little room, which is a replica of coming from one of the photographs and you can see it here being reconstructed in awkward way. And then of course gradually there's more planning happening, and this is where it all comes to place. But the challenge for this radio piece was that I wanted to generate layers of visual space where you would start with a photograph or a printed photograph pinned on the wall of a Japanese Zen garden, and then that would fall away because you'd realize it's just a photograph, and then the next layer would come, which is the introduction of one of the two actors, and then the next layer would come, which is the second actor replying from behind your head. And so the work becomes a description of sounds and spaces which are all around you. While this is of course an impossibility with a flat image. That's the curse and the benefit also of, or the generosity also of the 2D image. And we kind of built a precise system where we could very slowly get the camera to go backwards, and then a lot of rehearsal. But exceptionally, I shot this in one take, the first take. I didn't tell the actors that we were doing a good take. I told them that we were doing a rehearsal. Usually I would be working for 1 or 2 weeks with them. But really exceptionally, I decided to that it was perfect the way it was after one take. That's in the afternoon of the same day. And then we started working on the second part of the work, which was the end shot. So you have these two Chinese men speaking in a language which is foreign to most Westerners, Mandarin. And in fact, I don't even know up to this day exactly what they're saying. But Tessa told me that they had it translated, and which is strange because they're actually they're listening to a different piece of music than the one we are hearing in the headsets in the exhibition. I'm saying all this just to say how messy a production can be. So the 3D work comprises of making this facade, which is actually quite flat in Kowloon, but reconstructing it completely. And that's more or less the end result. And you can see, I think it's that window there in the middle of the image, which is the window where the two men are sitting. So you have to imagine it's one long track shot from the photograph of the Zen garden to this at the end. And that's just one way of trying to work with digital technology, but actually trying to work my way back to sensorial presence. to very simple phenomena. I like to stay away from political statements or to circumscribe them very slowly and very indirectly, as I've done in pieces like, as there are the Algiers sections of A Happy Moment, which for no reason I can explain was shown several times in Israel, while actually the subject of it is playing in Algeria. And there's always, a certain muteness when you approach the real subject on which you want to, it's like considering language not as something to say things, but precisely as that which is not being said. That's the approach that I'm trying to make. That you have to connect all the dots yourself. Then something completely different, which is also in our exhibition. It's titled The Pure Necessity, and it looks like it's been made by a totally different artist. And sometimes this might appear as if my production is schizophrenic. I was confronted with that quite poignantly last June when I showed at Showlager one recent work which is titled Olympia, the real-time disintegration of the Olympic Stadium of Berlin over the course of 1,000 years, which is a very monumental work displaying the Olympic Stadium as a computer model, but very photographic, so you don't actually, it's hard to distinguish between the real thing and the simulation. While doing so over the course of 1,000 years, which is the ideological end date of the Third Reich, as some of you know. So very serious piece. And then I was showing at the same time, which confused a lot of people, I was showing at the same time The Pure Necessity, which is based upon a Walt Disney animation, The Jungle Book. And it's only when you look twice that you start noticing how they connect to one another. With The Pure Necessity, the job that I had in front of me was to look at this animation from 1967, so vivid and so rhythmical and so positivistic. It's essentially a story of emancipation of a young lost orphan, which is a metaphor for modern humankind, which is without religion, without guidance. And then, strangely enough, those predators, the panther and the bear as well, dangerous creatures, actually take care of humankind and lead him back towards his or her own humanity. So all in all, a wonderful picture. And I was imagining what happens with The Pure Necessity 40 years later. I am confusing. What happens with The Jungle Book 40 years later? After the doctrine of people like Maggie Thatcher, who declared that there was no society but there were only individuals. And what happens when these creatures wouldn't have had a post-Disney career, but they would have roamed around in the jungle for the next 40 years? And I would encounter them again. Would they still be able to speak and dance and jump around? At the time when I got the idea, I was actually doing research for another piece in animal parks and zoos. And I noticed the boredom in animals. And the way part of their performance is entirely in our own heads, and we are constantly giving them a character or a role of an actor which they're not supposed to do. Which brought me to the idea of taking away all the anthropomorphic qualities, or as many as possible, including speech, from the original or from the initial Jungle Book animation. I wanted to produce 1 hour of animation, which is difficult. Why 1 hour? Because it's probably the clock is the sort of best friend of boredom and efficiency as well. It's this one thing that you can always fall back again and you know it has happened, 1 hour has passed. But I didn't actually manage to produce exactly 1 hour, it became 51 minutes. The last 9 minutes were just, I realized it was so heavy on my studio and on the finances. I realized that this 1 hour was really more a way to give myself the courage to continue working in it. And for a while we were good at 3D, I thought that we would work this way by making 3D models of the animals and then reintroducing them in the backgrounds, the original backgrounds, which we had isolated from the actors. But it didn't work. Somewhere halfway through the production, I realized that none of the animals had the juiciness and this delicacy that the movement of the Disney characters had. So we abandoned it. This is a silly joke of one of my assistants. So we started again, and I didn't really have a plan of how to do this, but I had all my footage taken in the zoos, and from that footage I tried to make a hybrid between how the original Jungle Book looked like and how my footage looked like in the zoos and in animal parks. And I recorded I don't know how many hours or days worth of footage. But slowly on, a kind of sequence did crystallize, which looks in sequence similar to the original Jungle Book. It starts with the village and it ends with the village. And in the middle there's the lake scene, there's the thunder scene at the end where Baloo is dying and where the, what are they called, these birds, which are British by the way, the vultures appear. Some animals were easier to do because they were so characteristic, and others were harder to make lazy. Like the snake is a very difficult animal to render lazy because it always has a certain tension. It has no expression whatsoever. A snake has no expression whatsoever. However it moves, it's elegant and brutal at the same time. But the bear, on the other hand, the way it moves, it's immediately you can fill it up with characteristics of humans. And so we started sketching out. I hired, I don't remember exactly, but between 12 and 14 professional animators. And we did it the old way, so it's step-by-step animation, where one of the animators started to imitate how the girl at the end of the film takes the water out. And she, this little girl is probably the main character in the work, or there are two. On one hand, there's the whole film, 50 minutes of animals, and at the end, there's the girl coming to fetch the water, singing this song which is really domesticated. It's about her growing up and getting married and doing the cooking while her husband goes out hunting, and she will send the daughter. It's like the ideal bourgeois picture. And it confronts and it actually amplifies the solitude of the creatures in the rest of the film. These are again some studies of King Louis also is present, but he's not saying a word. His fleas are taken out by the other ape. So asking to a group of professional animators to take away life from an animation is not so easy, because they're used to breathe in life in lines. And it was, in the first months were awkward. Several animators went away from the studio because either they had problems morally they thought I was stealing from Disney. They didn't realize the crusade I had to go through and the difficulty in producing this work. And then slowly it picked up and they came back. And these are images again from zoos over which we overlaid a nose and then integrate that back into the animation. There's even some, I think this is Jules Marais if I'm not mistaken. It's one of the two, there's Jules Marais and the other. We did studies after that, after these recordings, because they were very valuable. And also I realized that with the Jungle Book, the 1967 Jungle Book, every line, every motion is there to express. It's absolutely, it's a masterpiece. I wouldn't go to say it's art, because art profoundly changes you, but the 1967 animation profoundly orients you towards a certain, towards a certain love for the other, or a certain, that you have to respect all life. And you can feel that in each second of the original Jungle Book, this energy is inside. To separate the backgrounds from the foregrounds, we use the technology which semi-automatically clears away all the characters and then recomposes what it thinks that it can trace. It's an algorithm, and it recomposes the landscape. And as a draftsman and former painter, I have a lot of work also preparing the scenes. Sometimes I use drawing to reconnect to simplicity, because producing a work like that is very complex, and you can get lost in the work easily. There is always, this was François Truffaut, if I'm not mistaken, who once said, always on a film you begin with the greatest enthusiasm. And strangely enough, you have forgotten what a nightmare the previous production was. But what is certain is that by the end of the film, all you want to do is you want to go home. You just wrap the thing and go home, and you always wonder why on earth did we embark on this. These are all acrylic paintings. The word toddler, by the way, had nothing to do with Donald Trump, but it comes back several times in the studies. So, and then some stills. We had initially we had a black and white version. I thought we would never be able to accomplish a color version. I imagined it was too difficult to color in all the drawings. And I kind of liked the anemic version of the Jungle Book, where you had little color, but a very meager version of it. But then in the end it appeared that coloring it in was not so hard after all, and over a period of 3 to 4 months it was done. So we have two versions. These are the color versions. So at moments it's undistinguishable what's the original and what's the pure necessity. The title, by the way, refers to a very awkward translation into German, which well, I forgot how it came, but then it became the pure necessity. Titles are not important. All they are carriers of they're thumbnails of a work. And then maybe, if you allow me, I'll continue with a work that's not in the exhibition, but which is important to me, and of which I've spoken a little bit already. We've had radio piece. Which is the work with the long title, where actually for once the title does matter, as it indicates a duration which is completely paradoxical with anything that's software or computer generated. 1,000 years is a, in terms of computer world, 1,000 years is, at the same time, it's achievable. One could imagine a software running for 1,000 years precisely because it's inconceivable. We all know that things are software is being updated as we speak, but it's just hard to pin down exactly when. So also there you get this reintroduction of a certain power over the image, over which we have as users no power at all. And software is just this platform where eternity and instantaneity live together. You could easily imagine a piece of software running for a millennium, but you could also easily imagining that it's just very short-lived. What it is for sure is a constantly evolving platform. It's never the same. And I took this as a point of departure for the Olympia work. I had visited this place which is on the western edge of Berlin, and which is one of the buildings of the Third Reich which are relatively intact. But you know, the Germans, if anybody who has visited Berlin knows that the Germans are very good at kaputt machen, they say, at cleaning their past, restoring it up to the point where it absolutely has nothing to do with the confrontational aspect of the past. It's just one strategy like another. But they left this building quite intact. The difference is they made a roof over it because it was built in a hurry. It was built over a course of 3 years. It was designed in a hurry. It was designed by several architects. We often think that Albert Speer is the architect, which is not true. It's the two sons of the original architect, Otto March, who designed the first Olympic stadium or the Rijkssportveld, they called it, in Grunewald, which appeared to be a bad promotion stunt for the Third Reich because it was a typical 19th century place. It was actually focused on horse racing, and by the 1920s, horse racing was no longer central to sports or to society at all. So it was the Olympic Committee, presided by a Belgian guy, who then, of course, with the propaganda system in Nazi Germany, that convinced Hitler that it would be an ideal way to promote sports and corporeal culture and that's how actually on such a short time Germany became the prime candidate. It competed against Barcelona, and I've shown Olympia in Barcelona, which brought about a lot of stories with people. I actually wasn't aware that Barcelona was competing. But because Berlin had such a strong visual case with their design, they became the favorite candidate. But also, of course, because trouble broke out in Spain during the same period. So, as a sporting arena, the Olympic Stadium is actually much more of a theater environment. It's made to convert people into a certain religion, which is that of the Third Reich maybe, but it's also partly that of modernity. And it is repetitive. You have 175 columns around the building. And what you're seeing here, I should have said that a few minutes ago, are screenshots that are collected from my computer system, which is running day and night, every day and every night. Not for the next 1,000 years, that's a lie, but for the next 25 years. I promise to keep this work alive like a Frankenstein monster for the next 25 years. So it's being monitored all the time. And it's of a completely different nature of the pure necessity, as you imagine. But it also there are also similarities in the sense that you merge a biological reality with a fictional reality. And biological reality is life, it's aging, it's 25 years. So you could come back in 25 years and you would see the Olympic Stadium having changed only very marginally, very little. But you yourself have aged, that's undoubtable. And so it's a film, it's a different film from the other films in the sense that it ticks away with your own life. And with the day, with night, with the seasons, with the weather, which are all simulated, including the growth of vegetation, the decay of the building, the appearance of moss and of weeds. And I tend to call the work a techno-hippie work, in the sense that on one hand it's a computer doing its own thing, and even I am sometimes amazed that when I arrive at 5 o'clock in the morning and I see a sunrise in summer, how mistaken I am and how along I would go in believing that the sun is rising in Berlin, up to the point where we've had, it premiered in fact in Berlin, I think I forgot to mention. We had during winter days in Berlin, when it was shown at one location, 7 kilometers away from the Olympic Stadium, we had people flocking into the exhibition space looking at the snow when snow was announced and verifying if the snow came, and yes, it came and it accumulated. And it had this, remember what I said in the beginning? It had this analogy, although we've moved out of the analog world, but the analogies are still there. It had this analogy with life in the sense that it had the analogy with phenomena of life, such as snow falling down, which trigger simple reactions that actually, okay, yes, fine, life is going on. It's a simulation, but I'm still breathing, so therefore I am. So it's a form of, all the works are forms of redefining in a haptic way, sensorial way, redefining time and redefining what it is to feel time passing by. This may be an extreme version of it. And here we're still in 2016. I'm going to scroll forward a little bit. So inside the computer program, there's a secondary program running which is capturing these stills. And it's the only testimony of the work. The work can never be replayed. It can never be seen again. But for me, the most rewarding part of it is that I'm spending all this effort to make weeds grow and take over what we could call as this evil building. But essentially, it's also an extraordinary photogenic building. It's a building that was conceived to be photographed, which explains the successes of Leni Riefenstahl in depicting the athletes. It was a dream for a cinematographer because it was completely flat and it allowed for long, extensive track shots. It's a little too complicated to introduce you in how it was made. night, which, night disappears, but sometimes there's these magical moments at night where you have full moon or rain. The way it's working is that there's, in fact, two screens. There's one vertical screen and there's one horizontal, this one. And you don't see stills, actually. You see a constant animation which goes around the building once every hour. And the camera functions like a sunflower. When there's sun, the camera directs itself towards the sun. When there is a gray weather or rain, the camera follows an algorithm which is kind of indifferent, which doesn't follow anything in particular. But by definition, it goes around 24 times per day. And then the second screen, which is vertical, which is a detail, shows the artificiality, one could say, of the work. It shows details of the vegetation. Little flowers in spring, how they change, how they grow, how they blossom, and in autumn how they decay. So the second screen kind of is a little bit of a giveaway screen. And I have another keynote with the second screen, but that will take us too far. You can see in the corner there, there's this shape, which is a building that was built later in the 1960s by Le Corbusier, an unité d'habitation, which now became an icon for architectural lovers. And I left it there as a reminder of how quickly modernity decays. We're still in 2016. I apologize for that. I should scroll further. Somebody once asked me, why, if you have the power over an image like that, why don't you just fast forward it towards 3012 or 16? Sorry, 16, that's when we started. And I don't know, spontaneously, this makes no sense, but my answer was, why don't you eat all your dinners in one day? I was trying to say, you breathe, so pay attention to your breath and not to anything that you would like to compress. An image is not necessarily a willing victim. So voila, I think I've been speaking for an hour. I could go on with another work for a moment, or I could open it up to questions if you're ready for that.
I might take your cue. Does anybody Does anyone want to kick off with a question?
I know you're all very impressed, but can understand.
Thanks very much for a great talk. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the role of collaboration in the work, and I suppose there's lots of issues within that question about labour, because I found it really, really interesting to see the drawings and to hear about your kind of sort of history as a painter, and then to sort of fast forward to these amazingly involved sort of pieces, beautiful sort of pieces of work. And I suppose it would be interesting to hear about the evolution, because I'm also interested in learning more about the point at which 3D animation became a possibility for you in your work.
Mm-hmm. Labor is a little bit of the category of duration. No? It's this dirty word in a way. It has become, or at least hard, intensive labor made by a lot of people together working for something meticulously for a long time. It's the opposite of efficiency in a way. And the same goes with duration. If you spend a long time, it's almost as if you are of the category of the inefficient people. But I consider it as a value, in a way, which is why I love to pump in enormous amounts of labor almost so that it would pour through the work or come or emerge through the work as you watch it, as if it would become three-dimensional or a physical presence alone, the aspect of labor, where you would say this doesn't make sense that anybody would want to put so much work into something. But I find that almost as if it's a painterly tool. I consider it like a painterly tool almost. And the same goes for duration. If duration is a precious good, that means we have very little of it, or we consider that we have very little of it, which means that we should treat it as efficiently as possible. But what happens when you do the opposite? When you treat time or duration as the real gold, and you say, I have lots of it, I really have masses of it, and I can work with it as a physical presence, almost as a tool. So they're of that kind of category. I forgot for a moment what the second part of your question was.
No, that's interesting to hear you say that. I also wanted to, because I think that probably for a lot of the sort of younger artists here who are very interested, and there's a new generation of photographers that clearly are very interested in working in 3D animation.
Oh yeah, 3D animation. Yeah.
It kind of this idea of labour and the temporality and time taken to make a work becomes very, very important, and it's almost like a political sort of act.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I find that really interesting.
I mean, that's any cinematographer can tell you that, but in 3D animation, I realized the political implications of making an image better than or more poignantly than I realized it before. Because somehow a camera that lets the light comes in and that records this idea of sensitivity to things happening in the outside world is no longer there when you work in 3D. Everything you do are conscious decisions. So you play God in a way. You also play the author on a very deep level. And it also brings about a certain, I would say, responsibility, but that sounds so strange. But you become aware of all the ideological residue that's in any object, whether it's a tree or a car or a person. Even deciding the light. And I became acutely aware of another analogy. This is the fascinating thing with 3D. It's full of analogies with a lost world in a way, of evening light. And when we think of our culture being at the end of something, evening light of history, I was fascinated, yeah, but what does that mean? What does it mean? Are we in the up north where in summertime the sun never sets? Are we in that situation? So I was starting to think of what is night? What does night actually mean? What is this thing that keeps on lurking behind the horizon, which never happens? And so both postmodern times and synthetic images have in common that that there seems to be a profound love for evening light, because it's at peace somehow. And while maybe analog light is daylight, it's harsh light, and you can feel that back in architectural photography of the interbellum and of the 1920s, like when photography was really established. It's all about sunlight and clearly depicted shadows, and that all changes from mid-1980s on, and that brings back Baudrillard, of course. That's where Baudrillard comes in again. It's quite strikingly nobody likes Baudrillard anymore, or maybe younger generation picks him up again, but many of the older generations just remember the dual murder, the simulacra, etc. All these things that he repeated to death, but forget that he was actually announcing. He was announcing dark optics more explicitly than others did. That's how I got interested again in his work.
I was very interested to hear what you were saying about the future of photography and the journey that it's taking from its inception, where it had such an impact on painters. But I was just wondering what the photographer can do today to wrestle control back from the manipulators of the digital image.
That's a very tough question to answer because it's happening, and so there's absolutely no or very little historical events available to conclude anything out of it. But I think maybe by being aware in advance of the pitfalls of the industry, so learning about the new classifications of images, and that involves, as an illustration, what it means to have a handheld camera in the street and recording something. So, strangely enough, again, actually formal decisions and formal knowledge about technology in certain situations. And I'm sorry I can't be more concrete about this, or more direct about this, but because I don't know. But on the other, but really also paradoxically also being aware of the cliches and the pre-recorded information that pixelized images have. Pixelized images for people that of my age mean something very different than a 10-year-old boy or girl. Of a 10-year-old boy or girl, it means actually the genesis of digital imagery, because pixelation is kind of becoming a rarity. You have to zoom in, and soon when we zoom in, we won't get at the end of the picture. It will just go into another reality. It will just go into another piece of information. But what's for sure is that I think we'll carry with us, even on a purely ritualistic level, the camera, and going out and about and taking images. So there will be war photography. There will be presidential speech photography. There will be street photography. There will be nature photography. All that exists. But there are rituals performed on something that's dating back from memory, and you can kind of sense that already in all the online platforms that exist, which gather the work of photographers. It's a little bit like people going to church and celebrating a far distant God, and it becomes already in the discussions that you feel online, that you can read online on how to become a good nature photographer, or natural photographer, or wildlife photographer. Was looking for that word. There was no recipe, and now there are recipes. So, you know, what is for sure is that it's almost impossible to gain power over that which gains power over us making images. It's very hard. So you have to really do it out of a certain, probably a new kind of philosophy has to be invented to to deal with this merging of knowledge and image.
Hello, David.
Hey.
I've got a very specific question about Olympia for you, which might actually have a very short answer. It's such an extraordinary work, and it was fantastic to hear you talk about it in such detail. The building it depicts obviously is both real and specific. It really exists in the real world, and it's a very specific building. And I wondered if you'd had to consider or plan for if and when something happens to that building that changes its appearance and changes how it's known and understood, whether that's a storm or whether it's a bomb or something that might radically, in 5 years, 7 years time, mean that actually for the bulk of its the work's 25-year life, there could potentially be a chasm between your Olympia and the actual Olympia and how people perceive it.
Yeah, that's where God / the dictator comes in again. In the program, what's foreseen is the vegetation, the architectural decay, which is really, really slow. I thought it is actually a fragile building, but 25 years is nothing. So earthquakes are not being taken into the picture or in the account. So the earthquakes don't exist. So it's not if tomorrow there's an earthquake, the building will have lost a few stones more. Now the bulk of research goes into almost the irony of that you can feel in nature regaining ground on a building. And in the case of the Olympic Stadium, it's surprisingly, it's actually the trees that surround the compound, which are slowly approaching. The grass stays high for a very long time. It's already the case, that won't change much. But then, within 15 years, we'll have trees growing in the center of the Olympic Stadium, where the athletes are, which I found very weird, because in not so long time you'll have trees starting to appear through this one gate, which is this one. We call it the marathon gate, and it's the only opening up to the stadium that you see every now and then. And you'll see the tops of trees appearing there. So that's the only thing that it's actually been calculated. So natural disaster, nuclear war, and so then all not. I think at that moment it will be a relief to look at the software.
David, you talked earlier about the creation of an image and not needing that narrative over voice to kind of talk you through it and to drive you through it. But I'm thinking particularly in our show of The Quiet Shore and of Long Goodbye, that you absolutely play with that audience expectation that there is going to be some kind of dramatic churner. And I wonder if you'd comment on that a little bit.
In The Quiet Shore, both The Quiet Shore and Long Goodbye are mute works, which try to, my ideal spectator is the spectator who has given up looking at the work, in a way. And so it's like 95% of people say, oh, it's boring, let's go. We have better things to do. And I've often had that as a criticism, like I have other things to do with my life than sitting in front of this. But there is a transformation going on within the same thing. And in The Quiet Shore, the scene is clear, couldn't be clearer. It's a scene by a beach with dozens of people staring at a single point on the shore, which you don't get to see so easily. It's really only at the end of the film that you start noticing what is going on. And there's a young boy splashing the water. But because you only get to see it at the end of the film, by the time that you are at the end of the film, if you have the courage to stay, the appearance of the beach and the water has changed into something that's crystallized, that's fixated. And it's a metaphor for photography, but also for perception as something that can constantly, like a lake, freeze, and you have to break it constantly. You know, this is a sentence in Hölderlin, where he says, all you have to do every morning is break the ice of your own perception. And this is a thing which is through our culture is, it's a threat. Yeah? This icing in of the world around us. And I tried to make this a physical metaphor for the process from water, from liquidity to crystallization. And so by the end, when you see the little boy splashing into the water, which is an insignificant event, so I avoided direct political connotations, so there's no subject somewhere in a significant place done by a significant actor, which is always a bad idea, in my opinion. But it's done by a little boy who does actually nothing at all. And what you see is the change in material, but also inside, at least I hope, inside of yourself, a certain sense that the temperature has changed in the space. So all things that are not present, but that are somehow we're innate or born with. And in The Long Goodbye, it's two speeds which do not belong together, and which make up a missed encounter with this person in the screen, who at the end of the film, which is only 10 minutes, at the end of the film waves at you, but at that time when you start to understand the picture, it's too late, it's dark, it's getting dark. So the missed encounter is an important thing. It's again, it's like part of the resistance. Yeah? La résistance is we do not collaborate with technological power, but actually work with it and fight against it.
Thanks, David, for a fantastic talk. Just a question that kind of builds on what Katrina asked, the piece with the Berlin Stadium. The technology that you're using now to create this work is cutting edge, and it looks, up to date, but in 25 years' time, it's obviously going to be out of date, it's going to be dilapidated, as the stadium will be. So is there any built-in plan as the work progresses to update the software and technology that is driving the work throughout the process?
It's another one of these analogies where the software and therefore also the picture, although it may appear photographic now, will appear childlike in 25 years. We can be almost certain of that. While the building itself also decays. So it's just another analogy. But of course, there's a safe net in the sense that the building itself is a caricature of a building. It always comes across as fierce and monumental, and that will probably remain. So maybe the picture that I've made will not decay so easily visually. But I don't know about that. There are works that I've made at the beginning of my career. Sometimes a curator would come to me and would say, "Don't you have a higher definition version of that?" It's like as if almost, and then consequently, puts up the glasses and sees is there something wrong with perception. So that's a constant process where it's simply in our religion or let's say technological religion, to assume that our perception becomes sharper in concert with technological progression.
Speaking of early works, one of the pieces we're showing is called Cat and Bird and Peace, and it's on a monitor. And David and I decided to do this in recognition of the exhibition that Katrina curated 10 years ago in Dundee. And for us, it was really like looping back in time as well, how through making exhibitions you can cast that memory back through, and obviously a much earlier work, but that feeds into... So we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I find your work really inspiring. I have a question about the piece in Hong Kong, being from Hong Kong myself. I wonder whether you have considered doing the filming on location. Was it purely for practical reason that you had to build everything in the studio? And also you said you didn't know what the actors were saying. I mean, did you give them any instructions beforehand? And also, I suppose someone like myself who will be able to understand the meaning, the experience of watching the film would be quite different. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I couldn't tell them that what they had to say would have to be nonsense, or at least would have to be not more than a cloud in the sky, something that doesn't pin down the story. So I presented them with a piece of music, which they heard over the headsets, and which comes back in the installation, but which is actually not the music the sound that we are hearing in the installation. So they're talking about something else than what we as a public are witnessing. Then that aspect of being on location is one which is in fact the future of presence. The future of presence is telepresence. That's one of these dictums of modernity, is that I increasingly work with places where I've never been. And I did that ever since Travel. Because Travel was shot in a forest, in and around forests, but which are on different locations around the world. But I realized they were on different locations around the world in my head. And that includes all the preconceptions, prejudgments that I have about them. And with Radio Peace, that was no different. So I hesitated for a moment to actually go, but because the slum city of Kowloon doesn't exist as it was anymore, I realized I might just as well not do more research than what I did. That's the future of thinking. So let's say that the army, the resistance army of photography is diminishing in numbers rapidly. And the situations where one utters something, one makes something out of information is increasing rapidly. So one should expect a lot of fascist movements over the next generations, because that's what happens when you try to reinvent something from the past. But that's the future of image making.
And the other future of image making is also opening in the gallery tonight. So we have Rachel McLean's spectacular work from Scotland at Venice coming back. The opening's at 6 o'clock. It's Spite Your Face, obviously. This partnered with David Claerbout's wonderful exhibition. You're all very, very welcome to come. Thank you to ECA for everything, always, but particularly for inviting David to be part of this lecture series this Friday. Thank you to you all for coming, and please join me in giving David a really big hand of applause.
Thank you.